The towering gates of Westmont Academy stood like silent guards over its kingdom of privilege. The school, built on legacy and wealth, was home to the children of CEOs, politicians, and heirs to multi-million-dollar fortunes. And today, a new teacher was stepping into their world. Miss Denise Taylor adjusted the strap of her leather bag as she walked through the grand hallways of Westmont. She had worked hard to get here, degrees from Howard University and Columbia, years of experience shaping young minds, a passion for education that went beyond textbooks, but none of that mattered to them. She could feel the stares of students as she passed, some curious, some indifferent, and some downright hostile. Because to them she wasn't Westmont material, and no one made that clearer than Blake Wellington. Blake strolled into class late on the first day, making sure everyone saw him. Golden hair perfectly styled, a designer blazer casually thrown over his uniform. That smirk, one that said he owned the world. Miss Taylor watched him as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes brimming with arrogance. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he sneered, "Dr. Lancaster was supposed to teach this class. Are you sure you're in the right room?" The classroom fell silent. Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others snickered. Blake wasn't just questioning her credentials. He was challenging her existence in his world. Miss Taylor held her ground. She didn't flinch. She didn't show anger. Instead, she smiled. "No, Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "Dr. Lancaster retired. I am your new teacher." Blake raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Miss Taylor continued, her tone never wavering. "And I would appreciate it if you'd show me the same respect you'd give to Dr. Lancaster." The words hung in the air. For a brief second, Blake's smirk faltered, but then just as quickly it was back. He leaned back, stretching in his chair, utterly unfazed. "Well," he drawled, "I guess we'll see if you're worth respecting." A few students gasped. "Miss Taylor?" She didn't react. Not yet. By the end of the first week, Miss Taylor had won over most of her students. She made literature come alive, connecting novels to real-world issues. She introduced them to Faulkner, Morrison, Baldwin, writers who challenged perspectives. Most of the class engaged eagerly, but Blake, he was the exception. Every lesson he resisted. Every book he mocked. Every discussion he tried to twist into a power struggle. And then, one day he went too far. It happened during a discussion about diversity in literature. Blake leaned back in his chair, his tone dripping with boredom. "I don't see why we have to study diversity again," he said. Some students froze, but Blake kept going. "Why can't we just read something classic, something that actually matters?" Miss Taylor raised an eyebrow. "Faulkner is a classic," she replied. "He won the Nobel Prize for Literature." Blake shrugged. "Yeah? But my dad says we should focus on the Western canon. You know, real literature." The way he said real made the room tense. Then, with a smirk, he leaned forward, and that's when he dropped the bomb. "Didn't you used to teach at some inner-city school?" he asked. "Must be a culture shock teaching students who can actually read." The room went dead silent. A few students shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh or gasp. Blake just grinned, waiting for Miss Taylor's reaction. But he had no idea what he had just set in motion. Miss Taylor didn't flinch. She didn't snap back. Instead, she did something that made Blake's smirk disappear. She smiled. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost chilling, she said, "Mr. Wellington, gather your things. Wait for me in the hallway." Blake blinked. "What?" Miss Taylor's smile didn't fade. "I said, wait for me in the hallway." Blake hesitated. For the first time since this game had started, he wasn't sure if he was winning anymore. With a forced laugh, he stood up, grabbing his books. But as he walked to the door, something shifted. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Not fear, but something close to it. And he had no idea what was coming next. Blake Wellington leaned against the polished wooden lockers in the hallway, arms crossed, waiting. He wasn't nervous. At least that's what he told himself. But there was something about the way Miss Taylor had smiled, so calm, so certain, that unsettled him. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't gotten flustered. Instead, she had sent him out like a child being dismissed, and now she was making him wait. For the first time in his life, Blake wasn't in control. And he hated it. After what felt like forever, the classroom door clicked open. Miss Taylor stepped out, closing the door behind her with careful precision. She didn't fold her arms. She didn't glare. Instead, she simply stood there watching. Blake shifted uncomfortably. He smirked, trying to break the silence. "What now? You gonna give me detention?" Miss Taylor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, considering him. Then, in a voice so even it sent chills down his spine, she said, "Tell me, Blake, what do you think power looks like?" Blake frowned. That was not the question he expected. "What?" Miss Taylor didn't blink. "Power," she repeated. "What does it look like to you?" Blake scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Money," he said without hesitation. "Connections, status. It's about who you know, what you have, and what you can do." Miss Taylor nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "And do you think you have power?" she asked. Blake grinned. "Obviously." Miss Taylor smiled back, and that's when she delivered the first blow. "If you have so much power," she said smoothly, "why are you standing in the hallway right now, waiting for me?" Blake's smirk faltered, his jaw clenched slightly, but he shrugged. "Because you sent me out here. Big deal." Miss Taylor took a slow step forward. "You think power is money?" she said. "Influence, control." She leaned in slightly. "But real power, Blake? It's something you don't have yet." Blake's fingers curled into fists. "I could call my dad right now," he muttered. Miss Taylor smiled. "Go ahead." Blake blinked. "Wait, what?" She gestured to his pocket. "Call him," she said. "Tell him your new teacher hurt your feelings because she made you step outside." Blake hesitated. Miss Taylor's gaze didn't waver. "And then," she continued, "explain to him why you were sent out here in the first place." Blake swallowed hard, because for the first time, he realized he didn't have an explanation that wouldn't make him look bad. Miss Taylor stepped back, giving him space. "Blake, you've had power handed to you your whole life," she said. "But today, I'm giving you something you've never had before." Blake narrowed his eyes. "Oh, yeah? And what's that?" Miss Taylor's smile returned. "A choice." Blake frowned. "A choice?" She nodded. "You can walk back into that classroom right now, sit down, and pretend this never happened. Keep your power. Keep your pride. Keep the illusion that none of this matters." Blake stared at her. "And the other option?" Miss Taylor's expression sharpened. "Or you can stay out here a little longer and actually learn something." Blake crossed his arms. "Like what?" Miss Taylor's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "What it feels like to be powerless." Miss Taylor glanced at her watch. "Tomorrow, instead of coming to class, you'll be spending a day somewhere else." Blake frowned. "Where?" She pulled a white envelope from her pocket and held it out to him. "Everything you need to know is inside." Blake hesitated before taking it. "What's this?" Miss Taylor smiled. "An opportunity," she said, "one you can either take or ignore." Blake glanced at the envelope, then back at her. She didn't say anything else. She just turned and walked back into the classroom. Blake stood there, gripping the envelope, his mind racing. What the hell had he just signed up for? Blake sat in his father's private car, flipping the white envelope over in his hands. He hadn't opened it yet. Something about it made him uneasy. Miss Taylor's words still echoed in his mind. "You think power is money, influence, control, but real power? It's something you don't have yet. I'm giving you a choice." Blake was used to winning, but for the first time he felt like he'd lost a battle before it even started. Finally, with a sigh, he ripped the envelope open. Inside? an address, a handwritten note from Miss Taylor. Blake, show up. No car, no credit cards, just you. This is your choice. Make the right one. Blake gritted his teeth. No car, no credit card? This was already feeling like a bad idea. The next morning, Blake did something he had never done before. He took public transportation. He walked through a neighborhood he had never been to. He felt out of place in a way he never had before. The address led him to a small, aging school building. It wasn't like Westmont Academy. The walls weren't polished. There were no marble floors, no luxury cars in the parking lot. Instead, there were cracked sidewalks, kids wearing second-hand clothes, and teachers who looked exhausted but determined. Blake felt every eye on him as he walked. Inside, a woman at the front desk raised an eyebrow. "You the volunteer?" Blake hesitated. "Volunteer, I guess." She nodded, motioning for him to follow. Miss Taylor hadn't told him exactly what he'd be doing. She had just thrown him into it. He was placed in a third-grade classroom, helping kids who struggled with reading. He was paired with a boy named Jamal, who had trouble pronouncing words Blake had never thought twice about. He was forced to pay attention, to engage, to help, even when he felt completely out of his element. By lunchtime, Blake was exhausted. He didn't realize how much work it took to teach, how much patience, how much effort. And yet, these teachers did it every day. For kids who didn't have private tutors, for students who didn't have personal drivers, for children who didn't have the luxury of failing. For the first time, Blake started to get it. Near the end of the day, Blake sat with Jamal in the school library, helping him with a reading exercise. Jamal struggled through the words, but Blake didn't interrupt. He waited. Let him figure it out, and when Jamal finally got through the sentence, he grinned proudly. "I did it," Blake smirked, nodding. "Yeah, you did." Jamal's face lit up. Then, casually, he said, "Man, I wish my dad could see this." Blake froze. Something about the way Jamal said it, the way his voice trailed off, made Blake realize something. "Why can't he?" Blake asked. Jamal shrugged. "He's working. Always working. 2 jobs, sometimes 3. Blake was speechless. His own dad was barely around, but that was because he was always traveling, making deals, running companies. Jamal's dad? He was working just to survive. And suddenly, Blake's world felt a lot smaller. By the time Blake left the school, he was drained, but before he could get too lost in thought, he saw Miss Taylor waiting for him outside. She didn't say anything, just stood there, watching. Blake let out a breath. "You set me up?" Miss Taylor's lips twitched. "Did I?" Blake folded his arms. "This whole thing, it was a test, wasn't it?" Miss Taylor tilted her head. "Did it feel like a test?" Blake opened his mouth, then closed it. Because, honestly, it hadn't. It had felt real. Miss Taylor stepped forward. "What did you learn today?" she asked. Blake hesitated. He had 1,000 answers, but instead he said the only thing that really mattered. "I don't know yet." Miss Taylor smiled. "That," she said, "is the best answer you've ever given." Blake furrowed his brows. "Why?" Miss Taylor's gaze was steady. "Because for the first time, Blake," she said softly, "you're actually thinking." Blake had no comeback for that. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Blake Wellington sat in the back seat of his father's black luxury SUV, staring out the window. His mind was still stuck in that classroom. Jamal struggling through a sentence, the underfunded school, so different from Westmont. The quiet, tired way Jamal had said, "My dad is always working." For the first time in his life, Blake felt like he had seen something real, but reality came crashing back the moment he got home. Blake barely had time to drop his backpack before he heard it. "Blake, my office." "Now." His father's voice was sharp, controlled. Blake sighed, rubbing his temples. "Here we go." When he stepped into his father's home office, he found Edward Wellington standing behind his desk, arms crossed. billionaire businessman, owner of multiple corporations, and completely out of touch with reality. Edward's gray-blue eyes, the same ones Blake had, were filled with something between disappointment and disbelief. "Would you like to explain to me," he said, slowly, "why I got a phone call saying my son was volunteering at some inner-city school today?" Blake leaned against the doorframe. Not volunteering, learning. His father's eyebrow twitched. Blake had seen that look before. It meant danger. Edward exhaled sharply. "Blake, do you have any idea what this makes us look like?" Blake frowned. "What do you mean, us?" His father scoffed. "The Wellingtons, our family, our legacy. People will think we're—" He stopped himself. Blake crossed his arms. "Go on," he said. "Say it." Edward shook his head. "You don't understand. You don't get involved in things like this. These are not your problems." Blake felt something tighten in his chest. "These are not my problems," he repeated, his voice low. "Dad, do you even hear yourself?" Edward sighed. "Blake, I built this life so you wouldn't have to worry about things like—" "Like what? Real life?" Blake's voice was sharper now, fueled by something he wasn't used to feeling, anger that actually mattered. "Dad, these kids aren't dumb," he said, shaking his head. "They just don't have what we have. They don't have tutors. They don't have—" He stopped, his mind flashing back to Jamal. Jamal, struggling through a sentence. Jamal, grinning when he finally got it right. Jamal, wishing his dad could see it. Blake's throat tightened. Edward didn't notice. He just waved a hand. "This isn't your concern, Blake?" Blake clenched his jaw. "Why? Because it doesn't affect me?" Edward's expression darkened. "Because it's a distraction," he snapped. "You have a future waiting for you. A real one." Blake stared at him. For the first time in his life, he wondered, was this the future he even wanted? Edward stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "That teacher of yours, she's filling your head with nonsense. You're not one of those kids. You're a Wellington. That means something." Blake let out a breathless laugh. "You? Know what, Dad?" he muttered. "That's exactly what Miss Taylor wanted me to see." Edward's eyes narrowed. "What?" Blake pushed off the doorframe, shaking his head. "That bubble you live in? I just stepped outside of it. And for the first time, he didn't want to go back." Blake didn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about everything. Jamal, Miss Taylor, his father's words, and then the final part of Miss Taylor's lesson. Because when he had left the school, she had given him one last envelope. Blake had stuffed it in his pocket, not thinking much of it. But now he pulled it out, tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, in Miss Taylor's clear handwriting, were 2 words: "Final assignment." Blake's stomach tightened. At the bottom, written in sharp ink, was the only instruction: "Tell the truth." Blake let out a slow breath. Miss Taylor had given him a choice once. Now she was making him face it. And in front of the entire class. Blake Wellington had never been nervous in his life, until now. He stood at the front of his English classroom, gripping the edges of his paper so hard that it crumpled slightly. The assignment was simple. Tell the truth. But the truth? The truth was complicated. Blake's classmates were waiting. Some were bored, expecting the same cocky arrogance as always. Some were smirking, ready for him to turn this into a joke. Some were genuinely curious, because Blake Wellington actually looked different. And at the back of the classroom, Miss Taylor stood with her arms crossed, watching him carefully. Blake swallowed hard, then took a breath. And he started. "I used to think I knew what power was," Blake said, his voice steady. He glanced at his best friend Cole, who had been his partner in crime for years. "I thought it was about money, about knowing the right people." A few students nodded, because let's be real, that's how things worked at Westmont Academy. Blake exhaled slowly. But then Miss Taylor sent me somewhere. A school I'd never heard of. A place I'd never even thought about. The room went quiet. Blake hesitated for a second, but then he pushed forward. I met a kid there, he continued. His name is Jamal. He's in 3rd grade. He could feel some students shifting in their seats. Talking about poor kids. In this school, unheard of. Blake didn't stop. He struggles with reading, he said. But when he got through a sentence, he lit up like it was the best thing in the world. Blake's grip on the paper tightened. Jamal doesn't have tutors. He doesn't have a dad who can pull strings for him. But he tries. He works harder than any of us ever had to. He let out a sharp breath. And that's when I realized I never had to work for anything. The words felt like a slap in the silent room. Even Cole's smirk faded. Blake looked down at his paper, then back up. I thought I had power, he said. But I was wrong. His voice grew stronger. Power isn't money. It's not privilege. It's not being able to walk into a room and know people will listen because of your last name. He swallowed hard. Real power? It's knowing how to use what you have to make things better for people who don't. For the first time, he got it. And as the weight of those words settled in, so did the reality. He couldn't go back to who he was before. Silence. Then, a single clap. Blake's eyes snapped to Miss Taylor. She was clapping. Slow, deliberate, proud. And one by one, other students joined in. Not everyone, of course. Some still looked confused. But some understood. Because for the first time in his life, Blake hadn't tried to impress them. He had just been real. After class, as students shuffled out, Blake stayed behind. Miss Taylor raised an eyebrow. Something on your mind, Mr. Wellington? Blake hesitated, then nodded. I need to do more, he said simply. That school, Jamal's school. They need help. Miss Taylor's lips curved into a knowing smile. Sounds like you're starting to understand the assignment. Blake smirked slightly. Yeah, he admitted. I think I am. And for the first time, he felt like he was finally going in the right direction. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to stay updated. Your support means the world.